Aloha and welcome to Thumbing Through Yesterday, the podcast where we take our favorite books off the shelf, thumb through them, and remind ourselves why it is we love them so. My name's Tom Galley, and joining me today we've got Tony Pasculi.
Thanks again, Tom.
We are continuing our exploration of Stephen R. Donaldson's Gap cycle this week with The Gap into Madness, Chaos and Order, the fourth book of the series.
So now that we're 4 books in, it's kind of, like you say, it's getting kind of hard to keep them apart because it's one big story that all runs together. But so what is it? Is there anything that distinguishes this book for you?
You know, this is clearly building to a climax.
Yeah.
Right. So when we get into book 4, you know, books 1, 2, and 3 were all building blocks. Book 4, we're starting to really see these different story threads converge and get some idea of how they're converging and maybe a glimpse of what the end game might be. But yeah, it's just one long ass story that happens to be chopped up into 4 equally sized pieces and then the little prequel.
Interesting. I didn't have that sense of convergence in book 4. For me, that didn't happen until book 5. I still feel like we're diverging in book 4. Like book 1 is so claustrophobic. It's mostly Morn and Angus and a little bit of Nick. And then every successive book after that adds characters and locations and plot points and storylines. So it gets into a bigger, wider, vaster universe that just gets more and more complex and interesting with every book.
It definitely it never gets simple.
Yeah.
We're always adding layers of complexity.
I feel like, for me at least, in book 4, it's still on that divergent path. It's still getting more and more complicated.
I guess objectively, there's probably truth to that. Maybe I'm ascribing things to it, just because I've been through this. I was actually trying to puzzle out how many times have I read it, and I'm confident. Well, I'm 100% confident this is at least my 3rd pass through. I'm 80% certain it's either my 4th or 5th pass through.
Oh my goodness! Wow. Okay. So So why? So this is a favorite series. We talked about it before. You like the broken characters. I'm leaping ahead because we're going to talk about book 5 soon. But having gotten through all 5 books, I think it is rewarding. But I don't know that I would go back and read it again. Yeah, just because the beginning is so punishing. We could talk about more of that book 5. So what do you love about book 4?
Well, there are some. Well, like you said, we keep adding things, right? So I mean, we get a lot more about the Amnion in this one, and I just love the Amnion as an evil race. We are introduced to yet another bootleg space station, although this one's a scientific space station.
I love the bootleg science station. It's one of my favorite parts of this book. Yeah,
it's a little bit weird to me. Diener Beckman, that's the guy that runs it.
Yeah.
He's running an illegal space station to finance his personal research because he wants people to live inside of black holes.
I love that. That's amazing to me.
It's a bit of a stretch to me, but okay. I mean, this guy has a dream, however whack-a-mole that dream may be, and he has put together a secret research facility that he hires out to illegals so that he can finance his dreams.
Yeah, so there's a lot more science fiction in this book than there have been in some of the previous books, which I like. And I divided it up into good science fiction and bad science fiction.
All right.
That falls in the good science fiction side. That to me is reminiscent of the Hichi cycle by Frederick Pohl. We read the first one of those. Where, at some point, I don't know, it's not in the first book, but they talk about they encounter the adversary eventually, who are this alien race who are hiding inside black holes, and they're there because they're in the process of destroying the universe so they can reprogram it in a new Big Bang, more to their liking. Yeah. So the idea of going inside a black hole as a place to live, I love that. He doesn't get into it much. It's a very minor plot point, but it's one of my favorite parts of this book.
Well, it ends up being a little bit foreshadowing, too, because black holes end up being, very significant, albeit brief-lived elements 2 or 3 times in the overall cycle here, in the overall series.
Yeah, the singularity grenades.
Singularity grenades,
Very
which we're
fun
told
weapons.
time and again are worthless in combat, and yet they save Trumpet
Yep.
in this episode.
Yeah. This is actually my favorite line in the book, is humankind endured by being impractical, which is a very Heinlein-esque, view of humanity as scrappy underdogs that don't deserve their place in the universe, and yet they have clawed one out anyway by sheer determination and refusal to acknowledge the odds. It's human beings as Han Solo. Yeah, never tell me the odds. But this is in the context of someone using a singularity grenade. Soros is going, someone tells her they're impractical, and she says, impractical? If a black hole ate her ship, no one aboard would give a shit whether it was impractical. Love that.
Yep. Let's see, what else? Well, you talked about the ideas of good and bad science fiction. What else have you got on the good science fiction list there?
We already covered all the good stuff, sadly.
Okay.
Wait, no, we didn't. So Diener Beckman. I love, this is a great reveal for Holt Fassner. So he's got this weird, he wants to be the most powerful man in the universe. He's put himself in this position, and he's maintaining this uneasy peace with the amnion. And at first we think that's because this is just a way for him to consolidate power. But then it's revealed that if he can get his hands on this technology, that, basically a zone implant plus the amnion's force growth consciousness transfer, then that's a means to an end for him to live forever, which is his avowed goal. He wants to live forever.
He wants to live forever. And he is willing to treat with the amnion for it. He's willing to sell out all of humanity for it.
All of humanity, yes.
There is no goal more important than his continued survival.
Yeah, which is amazing. So that's a lovely piece of science fiction also, that idea. I like the kazes, and especially the threat of a genetic kaze. If the amnions get this technology before Holt Fassner does, and manage to create basically genetic terminators that are identical to human beings, except that they can spread mutagens, so they can pass for humans. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing was the delayed mutagens, which they use on
Soar's crew, Soar's Chatelaine and her...
It gets used on Soar, Soar's Chatelaine. She's a victim of that. And then she also creates a victim of, I don't know how you pronounce his name, Cairo, Chiro?
Let's go with Cyro.
Okay, let's go with Cairo.
Or Ciro. Yeah, and that breaks him.
Yeah, it really does.
It utterly breaks him. You said something and it triggered a thought, but we moved past it. It was about the...
Kazes?
The kazes, yeah. Now, I've actually thought that I think there's a hole in the story, a very, very large hole in the story. Now, the amnion want to create the perfect kaze, the Terminator-esque amnion. And now they have the knowledge that a human female that has a zone implant can survive the transfer process.
Yeah.
And this is somehow important to their idea. And this is why they are desperate to get their hands on Davies Highland.
Yeah.
And they are going to, ridiculous extremes, as we'll see in Book 5, completely unforeseeable extremes, to get this kid back. Why? You have the piece of information that you need. The piece of information is human female plus zone implant equals this works.
Yeah.
Surely you can get your hands on another human female. Surely you, the amnion, understand enough about technology to grow the equivalent of a zone implant and do the studies yourself. You have the fact that you need. It would be nice to have this proof of concept sample, but you have the fact. You have the piece of information. I kind of feel like there's another way out of this for the amnion where they actually win in about 50 years.
That bothered me also. I related to that was this idea that towards the end of this book, they're trying to escape from the from Soar's ship and the amnion defensive, and they're broadcasting. They've discovered the mutagen antidote, and they're broadcasting that to everybody. But they want to destroy the amnion ship because if they don't, they will devise an antidote. If they have access to the blood of someone who's got the antidote, the anti-mutagen, then they'll develop a counter.
Right, and they had taken the blood from Morn in the previous book while she was, after Nick had traded her for his continued survival.
But they're going to get that the first time they run into a human being that doesn't turn into an amnion. So, I mean, at best, it's a delay of, I don't know, 6 months, a year. It seems irrelevant to me.
Yeah, it seems like they're ascribing a little bit more importance, a little more significance. I don't know. I mean, this might be, the efforts to get, during World War II for the Allies to get their hands on the Enigma machine. Maybe it couldn't be too important, right? Maybe from the amnion perspective, having this information trumps all other needs.
They feel like they're patient, and World War II was a thing that was, a couple of years, and so a 6-month lead is going to make a huge difference in something that's 5 years long. But this competition with human beings is going to be endless. It's more like the Cold War.
Well, yeah, but as you brought up in the previous episode, the fear is not that humanity is immune and is just going to sit there being immune. The fear is that because humanity is now immune, they will strike first and the amnion will lose.
Yeah, that also, and this bothered me more when we got to book 5, that also bothers me. It's like, how much ship, boarding of ships and hand-to-hand combat is there? Why aren't they just attacking with long-range weapons? I don't know what immunity has to do with this, honestly. The stealth attack by the amnion makes a lot of sense to me. If they can infiltrate human beings, all trigger at once, boom, there's no way back from that. But if they're going to convert people one at a time, they have to physically be in their presence. And if they've got, photon cannons and matter cannons and lasers and if it's ship-to-ship combat or ship-to-base combat or ship-to-planet combat, all of that is irrelevant.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so I agree with you on that. It feels like the amnion desperation is forced. But then again, we are humans, so maybe we just lack that understanding.
Yeah.
All right, so bad science fiction.
Bad science fiction. All right, the one that drives me nuts, and maybe you have an explanation for this that I haven't considered. They use internal spin for gravity. We
talked about this a little bit.
Did we?
In an earlier one.
Okay.
Okay. I get the concept. And right, we had this in 2001. Discovery had an internal flywheel where the people hung out that spun, right? And then in 2010, when we find Discovery, it's tumbling in orbit around Jupiter because the flywheel froze up, right? And it let Stanley Kubrick shoot that wonderful sequence. They actually built the frickin' flywheel, right?
Well, that was in 2001. They had the... Yeah, so that's the only part of the ship in Discovery.
But it was only part of the ship, right?
Yeah.
But the idea that there's a hole within a hole, and that inner hole is spinning, so that on larger ships, and they distinguish between that. They say Captain's Fancy isn't large enough to do that, right? So they either spin the entire ship or it's thrust as gravity, but it doesn't have the internal hull like the warships do. But I'm sitting here thinking, okay, everything that interacts with the rest of the universe is on the outside of your ship. Your ray guns, your matter cannon guns, your scanners, your particle sniffers, your sifters, your radios, everything is on the outside of the ship. The people are on the inside of the ship, which is spinning. The idea of having a computer contact, even a simple electrical contact on the underside of a spinning platform is somewhat challenging. The idea of having to be able to connect, to send power to these external things when your power plant is spinning and it somehow has to connect to them. The logistics of that don't make any sense to me.
So that was the first thing I thought, because it was the only way I could make sense of it, is that there's a hull inside a hull, and the internal hull is spinning, so the external hull can be stationary, so you've got gravity going to the outside. But then as I was reading this, it doesn't seem to be what he's saying, and maybe I just misread it. But it sounds to me like what he's saying is that there's a dense internal core, and that thing is spinning, which creates gravity towards the center of the ship and not towards the outside.
I never got that. My interpretation of it has always been that there was a tube inside a tube, and the inner tube is spinning.
All right.
So the outside skin becomes the floor in that orientation.
Well, that makes more sense, but I don't see, like you say, I don't see what it buys you.
It buys you the fact that you can maneuver your ship without having to stop spin, right? You will always have regular gravity, whether or not you're under thrust. Even when they were going into combat, they usually didn't stop spin. Now, Punisher had to make an exception for that because her core was damaged. She was wobbly. And you can't have your ship wobbling when you're trying desperately not to get killed by the Amnion.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there are places where it's just like the command module, right? The tip of the ship is different, right? And you enter through the aft wall, and then the command stations are spread around the outside with the idea that what gravity is pulling you out, but it separates from the rest of the ship. So how can it have an internal core that's There are details to this that don't work in my head. In fact, as a concept, this doesn't work in my head.
Yeah. Okay, but I definitely misread that. So I'm going to take that off of the bad list. That's just it's not great, but it's not as bad as I thought.
Okay.
So, yeah. Maybe you can make sense of this one for me too then. The matter cannon. Which doesn't use matter. It uses light constant energy, which I don't know what that means. And it uses it to freeze matter in its path and accelerate it instantaneously to light speed. And then nothing can withstand against, any level of mass is going at light speed. Right.
It becomes effectively infinite at the moment that it transitions from being energy to being matter.
Yeah.
He came up with some sciencey sounding stuff and he wrote words together and we just have to buy into it. I'm going to go with that.
Okay.
I don't know that it makes sense, but it has quantum discontinuities around the edges, and this is a problem, particularly if you're a cyborg with enhanced vision.
It screws with your...
Yeah, it's ray guns that thump. I think it's like you could send a bullet at the speed of light, but as soon as it hits its object, it slows down from the speed of light to become a bullet again. It's kind of...
That would make more sense. That's not what I got
in my
this.
mind, and it's not what he says, but in my mind, they have found a way to actually have something that's balancing on the edge of light speed. And at a certain distance, it actually makes the transition back. And if you calculate very well, if that point of transition happens to be where your enemy starship is, there's just a phenomenal physical impact from that. But there's also some quantum discontinuities because it's cool to say quantum discontinuities.
There's also a lot of language about chaos and order around that and chaos theory, which seem to have nothing to do with this.
It has something to do with it because the name Chaos and Order plays into the title of the book.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
I think that's Donaldson being Donaldson.
That was a problem for me. This is a lot of I really appreciate the stylistic thing of the ancillary documentation where it's like, hey, here's a little info dump on some of the tech. But about half of those just didn't work for me as it's like, I would have liked this better if you didn't explain what was going on because your explanation makes no sense to me.
Alternately, he knows a ton more about quantum mechanics than we do. And this is actually, all the theoretical particle physicists out there reading this going, oh, wow, that's spot on.
Entirely possible. I have a note to that effect in book 5. Yeah, so we'll talk about that next time.
But but the gap drive, one thing I loved about the gap drive was the fact that A, it was invented by mistake, and B, the person who invented it and named it after herself is utterly forgotten.
Yeah.
And the only thing even close to being remembered is that people use the language that she erroneously used, going tack and resuming tard, to talk about going into and coming out of gap.
That's kind of a cringe. I mean, tack, I love tack. Tack is fine. Tard, not happy about that every single time I read it. And I get it. It makes sense. It's for tachyons and tardions.
Yep.
But at the same time, yeah.
Well, it was the lingo that developed.
Yep.
Anything else on your bad sci-fi list there?
No, that's it for bad sci-fi. Yeah. Those are pretty egregious, though, for me. Yeah.
Now, there are, since we're talking about things that don't work. So, and I commented on this before, occasionally characters within the context of a Donaldson story know more than they should about the context of the Donaldson story. Nick, when he sends one of his secret messages to UMCP DA, uses the phrase, "Kazis are such fun, don't you think?" Now, this happens after there has been a Kazi attack back at Earth, 2 Kazi attacks back at Earth, one at GCES and one on the UMCP HQ station. There's so damn many acronyms in these books.
Godson, Frick, and Sexton Vertigus.
Yep.
Yeah, were the targets, yeah.
But And then, of course, there's been the ongoing discussion about the genetic Kazi coming from the amnion. But Nick is unaware of any of this, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't know that there have been Kazi attacks on Earth. He doesn't know, or there's no particular reason for him to be brooding on the fact that the amnion probably want to have an infiltration program. And yet, out of nowhere, he sends these combination of words that, of course, send Hashi Lebwal into, virtual hysterics.
Yeah.
What does he know? What game is he playing?
Yeah, that was okay. Actually, speaking of good science fiction, one of the good things about this book is because they have the gap drive and they're able to use this sort of cheat to travel faster than light, means that they can't communicate with each other at the same. They can communicate at the same speed at which they travel. So it's really hard to send a message ahead unless you use what's called a gap drone. They just basically a message in a bottle and throw it through the gap. That's very smart, and I like that a lot. Until we get to the amnion. Is it this book or the next book?
This book.
This book. Okay.
This
the
book.
amnion. The amnion have some special effing crystals that do magic. They're basically magic crystals.
Well, it's a shame that Stephen wrote this when he did, because we could be talking about quantum entanglement, right?
We could.
Which didn't exist, or at least, was not a well-publicized thought chain at the time that he was writing this, which was, I have it written down here, 94.
Maybe it was. Yeah,
Maybe it was,
we knew about quantum entanglement. The problem with quantum entanglement, and you could fudge it. You could say some stuff about quantum. The best of our understanding right now is you can't use it to exchange information. Yeah. It's not. There's nothing that happens. When you reveal a particle's orientation here and then simultaneously or later over there, it's just that you have revealed something that was always true in both places, weirdly. Yeah.
I would have been happier to see him try and explain it that way than to create. I don't even remember how he had it working, but the upshot is the amnion had the ability to communicate in real time for a limited distance, like 3.5 light years or something like that.
2.7 light years.
2.7 light years, which damn near kills Trumpet and her crew.
Yeah.
All right, because as they're fleeing the Diener Beekman station. Right, so they've got one ship after them, two ships that they know of. They know the amnion are after them, and they know that SOAR is after them. They don't know that Free Lunch is after them, right, the mercenary contract ship. So as they're leaving the station, SOAR has left just before them to set up an ambush. They know she's out there. Angus knows she's out there. They don't know anything about Free Lunch, and they don't know that the amnion know where they are and can be there. So they end up at the wrong end of 3 hostiles at the same time, and their only defense is run and hide in the asteroids. Things were going pretty bad for them there.
Although that's a pretty gripping battle. It works out very well
Yep.
for them ultimately because of, partly luck and partly scrappiness and partly cleverness on the part of Angus.
And partly because, like you said, luck, the unbelievably timely arrival of Punisher.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Speaking of which, that was a shock. So Nick dies in that battle.
Nick dies unavenging him, not able to avenge himself, on the brink of it.
Yeah.
He monologues and loses.
He dies accomplishing nothing. He's one of our triad of characters. He's our central 3, where the whole pitch, as I understand it, is we're going to watch these 3 exchange places, and this is the dynamic that's going to fuel the whole series. And it's like, wait, what? We just lost one leg of our stool? Yeah.
Well, he got a very short run as the hero, right? When he first frees, and I'll throw that in air quotes, Morn from the clutches of Angus.
Yep.
He spends the rest of the story either victim or villain, or some weird combination of that most times.
Interesting. I saw him just as a villain. Where do you see his victimness?
Well, I mean, the fact that he gets broke, I mean, Mick Morn breaks him thoroughly emotionally. Saurus had wrecked him initially, and when he sees her, he gets even more broken. He ends up, he's a husk of a man. He's talking to himself. He's twitching.
Yeah.
Nobody pays attention to a word he says,
He does lose command, basically,
Yeah, he goes from being a legend to being baggage.
Yeah.
And, even when they agree to put him out and let him suicide himself against the ship, Source's ship, they send Zero or Pup. They send Pup out. I forget which one. I wrote it down. Anyway, they send out a bodyguard out with him to make sure.
Sid Mackern. Yeah.
Sid.
Yeah.
Sib. There we go. I knew it was one of the characters that you have a hard time really getting into.
Yeah.
Well, I have a hard time really getting into. But I mean, he almost does it, right? He manages to board Soar. He does enough damage that she loses her main cannon. And then he manages to get inside the ship and make it to the bridge. He's got the laser cannon pointed at Source's head, and he doesn't pull the trigger. He has to stop and monologue about, I've got you. And it gives her the chance to be just a little bit sneaky, right? And he takes his eyes off of her, and he points the gun at... it's not Mark Vestibule, it's the other transformed Amnion, Milos.
Oh, right. Milos, yeah.
And it gives Source and her crew the chance to shoot him dead.
Yeah.
Right, so there he is. He made it. I mean, he overcame unimaginable odds, did unthinkable things to get to that bridge and die.
Yeah, that's such an ignominious end for one of our, special characters.
Yep.
It's like if you're watching Game of Thrones and, well, actually that happens a lot in Game of Thrones.
I was going to say, that's a terrible example. I mean, we open up with, what's his name, that everybody's just sure is the main character of the story, and he's beheaded by episode 3,
Yeah. But it's different. He made it for 4 books. 4 books. Yeah.
Yep.
Interesting. I never saw him as a victim because a victim implies a victimizer. And he was victimized by Soros, but that's before our story starts.
Well, yeah, I mean...
I'm seeing him more as a villain who suffers the natural consequences of his villainy.
Okay, I could go with that. I feel like he's... this is going to sound awful. He's victimized by circumstance. Right. Oh, society did it. No, I'm not saying that. Bad society. But, I mean, he is... Whatever life he had built for himself, it was kind of working, right? He had the reputation. He certainly wasn't wealthy, but, he managed to, he was pulling in secret government contracts and getting paid for giving them polluted results and getting paid by other people for doing the same job. And, he was working the system, and he had the reputation. People looked up to him. His crew looked up to him. He had a ship. He was doing okay. I mean, he might not have been living the Earthian dream, but he was doing okay. And then it just all systematically gets taken away from him. His reputation, his presence, his command, his ship. He loses his chance at revenge. But you're right, there's not a victimizer.
Yeah, that to me just feels like justice. Yeah, Angus, on the other hand, Angus feels like a legit victim. What happens to him, even though he is an absolute villain, what happens to him is still horrific. And he does have tormentors, multiple tormentors. Nick is one of his tormentors. Milos Taverner is one of his tormentors. And of course, Warden Dios, who does this to him in the first place.
Hashili Ball.
Yeah.
How did you pronounce that name?
I've been saying Lebvol.
Ledvol? Okay.
Yeah, but who knows?
Who knows? We'll have to get Steve aside and ask him when we get a chance.
Yeah. And actually, so in book 4, and this shifts by the time we get to book 5 for me, but in book 4, I resent Donaldson for making me feel empathy for this horrible, horrible human being.
He goes a long way. And, Angus's story, I'm not at all, I'm jumping ahead of book, I'm not at all convinced I like the ending of Angus's story, but when we find out, and I don't think we find out in this book, when we find out how Angus knows how to edit data cores, oh my God.
It's horrible, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that scrap of knowledge doesn't come until the last book, though, so... Or is it this book?
I think it comes in this book, and we get it. What happens is everybody else finds out about it in the last book when they've kind of accepted him as one of their own, and then they're just like, you did what?
Yep.
You turned over 28 human beings to the Amnion?
He sold a shipload of humans, one of which was Mark Vestibule.
Yeah.
Mark Vestibule, well, sorry, that's a spoiler for the next episode. But this is how he has the knowledge to edit data core, which ends up how he gets free of Nick.
Yeah.
And begins what ultimately is something of a redemption arc. Whether he's redeemable or not is a good question.
Yeah, We should save that for the next episode.
We should.
One of the things, so you said this is how he gets free of Nick. What actually happens there, that is part of it, but what actually happens there is that Warden Dios, who's compelled by Holt Fastner to turn over Angus's codes to Nick, knowing that Nick is going to kill everyone, and Warden doesn't want them to do that, doesn't want him to do that, hides a special binary message which only Angus can read, which sort of sets him free.
It sets him free by letting him give his codes to Davies when Nick is not around.
And then that combination, once they get Nick out of the way, then after that they can sort of attack the data core.
Yep, he edits his data core and blocks the priority codes.
Yes.
Which will end up having some negative consequences, but we'll get to that.
Yeah.
So I want to jump back just a little bit. We talked about, I don't know why, but I have always just had a real soft spot when you have a road-hardened, put-away wet piece of war machinery entering into a desperate battle. The proud, shiny new starship wading into the fleet, okay, that's a proud, shiny new starship. But the one that has just gotten out of the battle, it's smoking, it's beat to hell, there's holes in it, it's missing guns, half its crew is dead, and they're heading into a desperate pitch battle. And that's what we have with Punisher, when she shows up at the Massive System and sees the Amnion warship. And she's just had an internal fire. She's missing sensor banks. She has been in constant rotation without relief for over 6 months. She's got crew that's sick, and she's going into, and she's punching above her weight class here against that Amnion ship. And yet they don't hesitate. They just,
I love that.
Right,
I love that heroism. They're basically saying, well, this is a suicide mission. We're taking on a ship that's way too big for us. All we can do is hope to stall them long enough for Trumpet to get away. And the only reason we're doing that is because we know they want to destroy Trumpet, and therefore it's probably to our advantage that they get away.
Yep.
Yeah, that's all they know.
Yeah, but I love that. That makes me tear up a little bit. Just that.
I love that
strength, or the desperation and nobility and determination that go into a conflict like that.
Yeah.
And we get to meet Dolph. I'm not even going to try.
I say Obikwe.
Obikwe, I'll go with
that. I don't know.
Who is definitely one of my favorite ancillary characters in this. And he ends up being, playing a couple of really significant roles towards the end. But he is just fun. He doesn't like being pushed around, but at the same time, if he's going to be pushed around, he's going to take it and he's going to enforce what he's been told to do. I don't know. I like him. I think he's a fun character in this.
All right, so we talked about the arc for. So this is how you sold me on this series. is that this is inspired by Wagner's Ring Cycle, and that Donaldson wanted to take these three characters and then rotate them through these various roles of villain, victim, and hero. And so one of the things I was expecting is that all three of them would take on all three roles at some point or another, and at least as far as we got to in this book, I don't see that. So you see a little bit of victim in Nick. I don't. I just see hero and villain. So I see hero to villain, and it's a pretty short walk. Yeah. Angus goes from villain to victim, and Morn goes from victim to hero. Although her heroism sort of is even. Well, I guess it's here. It's here in this book, and then we get even more of it in the next book.
Yeah, but it's a very passive form of heroism. It's not.
In this book, it is. I agree.
Yeah.
In book 5, I think we see something else from her.
Yeah. She does get to get a bit of evolution there.
Yeah.
I love the fact, and let me make sure I'm in the right book here. Nope, wrong book. Okay. Forget I mentioned that.
All right, I got one more thing on this book, which is, and it's nothing to do with this book specifically, but this is when I got invested in this. So the other thing is that, it's like this is supposed to be inspired by the Ring Cycle, which I am not familiar with.
Nor am I.
And so I went looking for stuff about this, and every single person who mentions this series mentions that it's inspired by the Ring Cycle with no detail beyond that.
You see, I think somebody wrote this once, and it may well have been Donaldson himself in the afterword for the first book, where he's talking about he set out to try and do this. The mantis shrimp, for example. The mantis shrimp hunts by it punching things with it's got two little specialized forelegs, and it punches things. And the velocity, and if you look up any story about the mantis shrimp, you're going to see this term, is faster than a .22 bullet.
Interesting.
And I'm not saying that it's not, but every single reference you look up, and okay, pause the podcast right now. You're sitting at a computer, Google it right quick, mantis shrimp, and it will say it attacks by punching things faster than the speed of a .22 bullet. Somebody wrote it once, and then everybody since then who's researched it has come across that phrase and thought, I like that. I'm going to copy it over.
So I think there's more to it than that, because I did find one article that actually breaks down the similarities. And the problem is that I don't know, I'm not familiar enough with the ring cycle or the original source material for the ring cycle, which was a couple of legends. One is the Ring of the Nibelungelid. It's about a magical ring, which may have also been a source for Tolkien. I don't know. But there are some extreme similarities that cannot have been accidents. So I do think it was deliberate. So Warden Dios is supposed to be Wotan or Odin.
Okay.
And he's got the one eye.
He does have the one eye because he's got the IR prosthesis.
And Holt Fastner, this is where his name comes from. In the ring cycle, there are two giants, Fasolt and Fafnir. And if you put them together...
Okay.
Yeah.
I can see that.
But they are the ones who build Valhalla for Wotan, which doesn't seem to be his place in the universe, so I'm not sure what's going on there. And then Min Donner is supposed to be, Donner is the German word for thunder. So she's the god of thunder, Thor, basically, in different terminology.
It kind of fits.
Yeah. And there's more, and it's like, but without spending an equal amount of time on the ring cycle, I'm not going to be able to appreciate that.
I'm just going to take Donaldson at his word that he was familiar with the ring cycle and he wanted to use that as an inspiration for the story, and that he did draw on it.
But it's definitely not a retelling.
No.
Oh, and of course the last book, which is This Day All Gods Must Die, which is Götterdämmerung, the Twilight of the Gods.
Yeah.
So it's good to know that there's something to it, but it didn't lend a lot to my appreciation of the books while I was reading them. There's just not enough there for me.
Didn't add to it, yeah. All right. On one last thing I've got, and this is a silly little thing. I think this is probably my least favorite thing in the entire series, though.
Ooh, okay.
And we're here in the middle of book 4. Angus and Morn are going at it. They're yelling at each other. They're unburdening themselves. And Angus, however it comes out, he's just... One of the things he's so furious at her about is the fact that she could not wait to get her hands on Nick. From his perception, the fact that she wanted Nick had nothing to do with her trying to get away from him. It was that Nick was just so virile and she was so feminine, she couldn't help but be attracted to him. And she's like, I have absolutely no interest in anything male ever again. All I wanted was away from you. He chuckles and he says, shit, Morn, if I'd have known that. He just completely... breaks character. He stops being Angus in that moment, and he's suddenly just a guy who has realized he's made a mistake and he's ready to move on. Now, of course, none of those things happen. But I mean, the way he says that, the way it pulls him out of the fight instinct there, he chuckles and throws off this offhanded line. This is not Angus Thermopylae. This is not the kid that was bound to the slats in the crib. This is not the guy who's so terrified of EVA that he'll go EVA to save his own life. This is not the toad bloated with malice that he's been described as. And yet, here he is just shrugging it off because...
Interesting. I didn't take that way. I mean, I see how it jars you. One of the things that's so gross about Angus... is that I think he genuinely loves Morn. He's not just this pillager. I think he's legit in love with her.
As much as he's capable of being.
As much as he's capable of being, which is not very, because he, like you say, we learn in his backstory that he was abused as a child by his mother. So he's got a weird relationship with violence and women. And he's a broken man. And it's not a surprise, although it doesn't excuse it, it's not a surprise that he has these terrible instincts. But I think all of that in mind, I think he genuinely loves her, and that's where his jealousy against Nick comes from. And I think he's realizing in that moment that he could have played things differently. And he's wrong.
He's wrong. Very much wrong.
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, and relatively early on, I think maybe even in book 1, he comes to the realization that he can't hurt Morn without hurting himself.
Yeah.
Not that stops him. Yeah, that's a weird...
It is weird, though. I grant you. He's a weird
Yep. But that moment is just, I mean, he does uncharacteristic things. He makes uncharacteristic decisions, and part of these are character evolution, and part of these are circumstance driven. But that moment, it's like
that's too much for you.
He was possessed by a different human being to deliver that line of dialogue. It just doesn't work for me anyway.
Maybe it's the stage direction there. It's the chuckle.
The chuckle is actually what, he is not a chuckler.
No, he's not. He's not. Yeah.
All right.
So what's next?
Well, we've got one more book to go, right? The last book of the series, This Day, All Gods Die.
Yeah. The Gap into Ruin.
All right. So we will see you in 2 weeks.
See you in 2 weeks.